Welcome back to This Week I Tried, or TWIT for short. The premise is simple: I play games, write a script, then make a video multiple months later. This week I tried Night in the Woods, and by God is this game a lot of things, and a game is barely one of them. It's a social commentary, a slice of life story, a deep dive into mental health, and ultimately more relatable than I care to admit. This game was made by Infinity Fool, founded by Alex Holocka and Scott Benson, who are both apparently famous, but not so much that I knew who they were before researching this game. Everything this studio has done has been related to this game, with 2 spin-offs and a recently hinted at new game that may or may not be, but probably is, a sequel to this game. A few points to be made before we begin. This game has some platforming and a few mini-games, but ultimately these features are irrelevant. This is a story game, plain and simple, that could have done just as well, if not better, being a visual novel. Secondly, this is the kind of game where you cannot experience everything in one playthrough, which is annoying considering how a large proportion of the game feels dull and seems to deter rather than help the story. Both of the secondary characters have their own endings, and you cannot see every scene in one playthrough. Especially a natural first playthrough before you realise how important exploring is. Thirdly, this game is a living, breathing trigger warning. Issues addressed include in some form suicide, family abuse, anxiety, psychotic breaks, delinquency, self-harm, knifey, drugs depression, hot fuzz village cults, the nature of God, existential dread, along with probably many others. On top of that, unless you explore everything, some don't even get resolved, and even if you do explore, some still won't get quote-unquote resolved. With that out the way, let's start with the premise. You play as May, who dropped out of college for reasons she refuses to share until the latter half of the game. She returns home to a rural Nowheresville, where her parents are disappointed, kinda, her friends have moved on, kinda, and her life has come to a halt, if not veered drastically into reverse. You then play through May's attempt to enjoy her return home, rekindle old flames and friendships, and generally get back on track. Something that is unquestionably difficult once you realise how ultimately broken May is. Especially when you consider nearly every character you meet is also broken, yet somehow May is so much more twisted, jaded, and honestly just worse. I feel I should point out a little thing I noticed while reading other reviews for inspiration. Everyone seems to have a character they greatly dislike, but there is far from anything resembling a consensus on who that is. For example, Polygon disliked May, which I find somewhat ludicrous. On the other hand, they hail B as some kind of goddess, and I despise her. I'd presume the reasoning for this derives from this game's amazing character design that invokes a real feeling of relatability, which in turn can also be a feeling of great disdain. Without spoiling too much, the main characters are Greg, the delinquent verging on anarchist best friend, his boyfriend Angus, who is the more toned down and quiet voice of pseudo-reason. Then there is B, the inheritor of a family shop, who is both apathetic and mature in a distinct mixture that in my opinion turned her into a bit of a cow. Ironic considering she is a crocodile, perhaps because she is so snappy. Oh yeah, everyone's an animal. May is a cat because she's arbitrary and distant, Greg is a fox because he's inherently destructive and doesn't like to be tied down, B is a crocodile because she will bite your head off at the slightest comment, and not because she's thick-skinned, and Angus is a bear because he's so damn likeable, adorable even, so long as you aren't on his bad side. All these characters, plus all the auxiliary characters, are amazingly written to be empathised with. I wish I could go into more detail without spoiling things, but I guess except for Greg and B, who talking to initiates the next phase, my only advice is to talk to everyone, which will involve a lot of exploring. Check the rooftops, the interiors of buildings, the far left and rights of the world and not just the political ones, the tunnels, and the wilderness as they become available. I guess I'll give you a favourite. You can open a 3rd, maybe 4th floor window in the centre of town and get a storyline through that. With the premise out the way, I might as well get on to some actual reviewing. The soundtrack in this game is very good, especially during the dream sequences where one might argue the soundtrack is the only good thing about them. The music generally seems to be well timed. I cannot think of a moment where the music was not fitting what I was doing at the time. Combine that with the fact the music is both catchy and atmospheric, I can't help but give this game's soundtrack an A star. There's not much more to go into music-wise, being that I'm not a musician, but compared to the last two TWITs, I can say the music feels a bit more modern and fresh, even higher budget, although I'm not entirely sure it is. There's also a Guitar Hero-esque minigame related to the soundtrack, alongside some you won't even hear throughout the game, or at least that I remember hearing. Moving on, as mentioned earlier, the writing in this game is amazing. There are two ways this game is well written. First being the previously mentioned character writing that makes everything so relatable and deep. The second, and my favourite aspect of the game's writing, is that it's hilarious. It has a certain cynical dark humour to it that is delivered so bluntly and proudly it gets me every time. There are more than a few lines that completely broke me when I heard them for the first time, and part of the reason why I like Greg's route so much is that it has some of the best jokes in the game. After the writing and the soundtrack, there is of course the art style. A cartoony art style with a heavy focus on eyes. There's May's dark and empty eyes, B's pronounced and judgmental eyes, Greg's sly and mischievous eyes, and Angus's hidden eyes behind his normal glasses. The character design is amazing for the kind of game this is. Furthermore, the way the characters are designed to fit into the world prevents them from feeling like 2D characters on a 2D background, but rather instead part of a flowing, moving image. Outside of the characters, the world is humble and practical. The houses feel like houses, and the diner feels like a diner, and they all are obviously what they are meant to be. They are not outlandish or weird. There are exceptions to this. The murals in a few locations and the church are a bit over the top compared to the rest of the world, but they are pretty and produce strong feelings, which I guess is the point. However, the world design can be a bit annoying at times, with it being hard to tell, especially in the long-winded dream sequences, what you can and cannot climb. This is because you cannot tell what is in the background or the foreground. Being a story-based game, I'm going to try and summarise the story in a way that covers almost nothing. There are events that just happen, everyone comments on them, and then it is rarely mentioned again, at least until the latter half of the story where everything is tied together. The game is split into chapters, but they are almost arbitrary, with the final chapter going on for about 3 times the length of the others. I feel it is important to note that some arcs are unique to certain chapters, yet some exist for the whole game. Hence the previously mentioned need to explore. You will miss things if you don't explore, such as the stories that an old lady in the sewers tells on completely random days, or at least as far as I can tell, completely random days. Not all of these stories are created equal. Some are good, some are bad, and some are needed to get good endings. I will once again stress my only tip for this game is to explore all storylines. That includes those of the people in the sewer, those on the rooftops, and those that you get from exploring random windows. My biggest complaint with the game is that while the story is good overall, it takes a long time to get started, or rather it starts early on and is not continued again until later. The only other game I know that does this is the game I keep mentioning, Persona 4. The story is seemingly put on a complete pause so you can do the side content, but unlike Persona 4 where the side content is needed to get a good ending, in this game they're their own thing, with some being completed at the end of the game and others completed as you do them. The issue with this is that those that are added at the end of the game feel like they were jury-rigged in, and those that are completed the moment you do them feel lackluster as you consistently check in with those characters only to receive near to nothing. However, accompanying these complaints is a disclaimer. All my complaints, beyond those to do with the dream sequences, only materialised as I wrote this review. While playing the game I didn't notice these issues as I wasn't entirely sure they were there. There was an itching in the back of my head that they were there, but I didn't know it. It was only with hindsight that I realised some of the storylines were a bit naff compared to others, and I only noticed at the end of my streams while watching Greg's ending that I had missed half the content, that belonging to B, which I still think might be a blessing in disguise. So for the totally legitimate score I give all TWIT games, I give Night in the Woods a hindsight is a bitch over this game as an experience and not a game. I do still strongly recommend this game, although it might be cheaper to experience it vicariously through a streamer, and those who watch my stream would probably agree, as they were just as moved as I was, so I feel this is not a terrible idea for anyone else other than the supposedly famous people behind this game. And so TWIT number 3 is down. Once again, please give your feedback below through likes and comments, and check out the socials which are on screen. I also stream at twitch.tv/JamieGames every weekday at 6 PM British time, which is normally when I play the games I eventually make these twits on.